Well, hello again, brothers and sisters. It's good to see you and be with you again. All right, so we're moving onward with our series on the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount. We began looking at the Beatitude of Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted, and we're going to continue with our discussion on that Beatitude today. So again, just a couple points by way of review and reminder to keep before us as we go through these Beatitudes. So remember that the Beatitudes all are 8 specific statements where Jesus pronounces a blessing upon someone based upon a particular characteristic of their heart, all with the exception of the last one, which deals with the condition of being persecuted. So that's not a state of heart, but the state of being persecuted because of one's conviction about Christ. But all the other Beatitudes address the character of one's heart. And so we're introduced again to this fundamental principle of Jesus' rule, if you will, universal rule about all spiritual reality and moral reality where human beings are concerned, that there is an inside to our being and there's an outside to our being, and they can never be separated. What is inside is the state and condition of one's heart. What is outside is one's behavior, activity, or actions. And one's behavior, activity, and actions, the outside of their life, is determined by the condition of the inside of their heart. So Jesus says if a tree is bad, then the fruit will be bad. If the tree is good, the fruit will be good. The focus in Jesus' ethics and spiritual teaching is that human beings are on the inside bad. They may try of their own accord to, quote, do things that are good, and that in and of itself is a commendable truth and reality. But nevertheless, it doesn't alter the fact that human beings remain inside not good. And so from within, human beings need to be transformed, born anew, made new, put to death, and then made new. So that's the fundamental essence of Jesus' teaching on those principles. And Jesus is describing the inner state of one's heart when that person is a subject in the kingdom of God. So again, the word blessed is not merely being happy. Sometimes people offer that as a way to think about what it means to be blessed. Blessed is much more than happiness, or I might say something that is a much deeper happiness. It is a happiness that comes from knowing that you and I are the benefactors of the goodness and the kindness and the grace of God towards us. And that produces that unique joy that comes from knowing that we have been blessed by God. We then keep reminding us about the paradoxical nature of many of the Beatitudes. That is, the Beatitudes describe the happiness of someone in the kingdom, and yet the things that Jesus commends as fundamental sources of genuine happiness are, on the surface at least, sound contradictory. Like they couldn't possibly produce happiness. So how can one be poor in spirit and be blessed? How can one, particularly this one, how could one be in a mournful state, which seems to be the exact opposite of being in a happy state, and yet be said to be blessed and happy, even though you are in a state of mourning? So, with that said, remember that the word mourning as used in this passage and many other times refers to mourning as we still use it to this day. And that mourning refers to deep sorrow and grief. It oftentimes is associated with the grief connected with someone's death, although it's not limited to that. But it's primarily focusing on this deep, profound sense of grief and sorrow. So this is not mere occasions of sadness and disappointment. These are deep, cutting to the heart forms of sorrow and grief and sadness. We then notice that the blessing is not the mourning in and of itself. Just merely from mourning, there is not blessing. But we're going to see the blessing comes from what the mourning is over and what the occasion of the mourning is. And of course, the blessing is found ultimately in that God uniquely comforts us in the midst of our mourning. So I want to move now to what begins with this observation, and that is that what causes us to mourn can reveal the character of our hearts. I have heard it said that you can tell a lot about a person. There's different ways that people will say things, how you can tell a lot of people. So you know a lot about people not only by who their friends are, but you know a lot about people by who their enemies are, right? And it has been said that you can tell a lot about a person by what makes them laugh and what makes them cry. What makes them laugh and what makes them cry. Now, I'm not suggesting that's a universal proof or a universal test, but I want to show you that the ability to mourn over certain types of things is an indicator of genuine spiritual health and well-being. And the inability to mourn over certain kinds of things is an indicator of genuine spiritual disease. And it is an indicator sometimes of a hardened, corrupt, and unfeeling soul. And when the heart gets to that state, it is in a very, very hazardous and terrifying state and condition. So, I left off in the lesson last week asking the question, what is blessed mourning? What kinds of mourning can we see that even though it involves mourning, nevertheless becomes an occasion for blessedness, for finding oneself being the recipient of the goodness of God, even though you're enduring a great deal of grief. So I'm only going to focus on two. I may extend this to one more lesson next week, as there's many other insights on this topic that are found throughout the Bible. But I'm just going to narrow them down to two today, and I want to give two examples of blessed mourning. Okay, so the first one we're going to simply refer to as mourning over our sinful condition and its effects upon us, upon others, and upon God. All right, so there is a blessed mourning that comes to us when we are grieved or have enough sensitivity within our souls that we are capable and continue to be capable to be grieved and sorrowful over our sin and, yes, over its impact and its effects on us, on others, and upon God. And when someone can't mourn over their sin and can't be grieved over what their sin has done to them, to others, and to God, then that person has what can only be described as a hardened heart, a heart that is past feeling, a heart that has almost no sensitivity, a heart, as Paul said, has someone whose heart is and their conscience has been seared with a hot iron. It can't feel anything anymore. So that's what we have to understand and what we have to realize. I can tell you that there was someone, I'll just tell you, it's my father who has passed almost 20 years ago. But my father was a man, at the last time that I saw him in my life, was a man that I honestly believed had lost any sensitivity or capacity to realize and to feel or to be grieved or sorrowful over his sinful behavior and how it affected him and how it affected my mother and myself and my sisters and our family as a whole, and God himself. It seemed like my father was, in some sense, past feeling. So this is a state and a condition that is real, and we have to be aware of that. And that's why Jesus wants us to know that although this mourning over your sin and grieving over your sin is, yes, by its very definition, very painful and difficult, and something that's not a pleasant experience, it nevertheless is vital. And in our grief over our sin, we will always, 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 and never cease to find the God who is merciful and gracious and who loves us, ready to help us always in our time of need. So I say here that while sin is always spiritually unhealthy, so it's never good for us to sin, yet to be filled with a sincere sorrow and grief over our sin is a sign of spiritual health. Okay? So it's never good to sin, and that we sin is a sign that the inside has yet to be fully transformed and completed, and that's not going to happen until resurrection. But nevertheless, to sin becomes an evidence that there is still the inside transformation and even the bodily transformation, because our mortal condition is a fundamental occasion for sin in our life. Too many of us in the church don't appreciate that, I think. But so it's never a good thing to sin. And sin is a sign that things are not good within us. At the same time, to be grieved over our sin is a sign that we still have a soul. It's a sign that there is still some vitality and life within us, that it's still a sign that we can mature and we can grow. And I know that sounds kind of strange if you feel like, well, I've been sorrowful and sad and grieving over my sin my entire Christian life. Well, that's great. That's better than not being sorrowful anymore and not being bothered and vexed by your sin at all. Okay? It's much better for us to have the latter, to have the first one than to have the latter. So, coming to terms with our sin can be profoundly painful, but is essential if we would seek not to be controlled by our sin, and we need to experience sorrow for sin because it can continue to help us to surrender ourselves to God's grace constantly. So if we lost our, as I used this term earlier, if we lost our sensitivity to our moral failures and what they do to us and others, if we no longer could feel within our soul the impact of our sin on us and upon others and upon God, then we would never feel any urgency to repent. We would never feel any urgency to reform or to improve our lives. But if we remain sensitive to our sin, and we remain keenly aware of how deeply, deeply flawed we are, and that apart from the grace and the promise of the gospel of Jesus Christ, we don't have any hope, then we actually find ourselves in a place where we are meek, where we are poor in spirit, because this is a hallmark of someone who's poor in spirit, right? They know how destitute they really, truly are, and thus they turn themselves over to God. Now, there are several passages in the Bible which speak about and give insight into this type of mourning that is blessed, but I'm just going to mention King David as perhaps the best model for what this blessed mourning looks like. So David's episode with his adultery with Bathsheba and his murder of Bathsheba's husband Uriah. So, of course, the brief rundown is that David is the king. He is out on his roof one day. He sees a beautiful woman bathing. He insists that she come to his palace. I think this gets easily watered over and not appreciated, But what David does is nothing less than sexual assault. To think that this was some kind of romantic rendezvous where David invited this woman to come over to his home and have a romantic candlelight dinner and then a romantic evening of passion together is simply ridiculous. This woman did not have any choice in this matter. She was ordered to come to the palace because it was the king. She was a married woman who was committed to her husband and came over to the palace and no doubt resisted and did not believe that what the king was going to do was appropriate, but David had his way with her anyway. Let's not water down the obvious implications of what has happened here between David and Bathsheba. Now, after this episode transpires, Bathsheba is just found to be pregnant. So David now has a big problem on his hand. How is he going to solve this problem in light of the fact that Bathsheba's husband Uriah is out to war? And if he's out to war, then how did his wife become pregnant with a child? So David brings Uriah back, attempts to get him drunk, to persuade him in different ways to get him to sleep with his wife so that he can cover himself. Uriah says that his honor demands that he not enjoy the company and the comforts of being with his wife when his fellow soldiers are out at war. And so eventually David works up a scheme to have Uriah go into battle and have the troops pull back and expose Uriah, and Uriah ends up being killed. All of this takes place under David's conniving and scheming, and David thinks he's gotten away with what he's done. And so we are introduced in the book of 2 Kings to the prophet Nathan, who speaks to David, talks to him, and gives him a parable about a king and a slave who had a little ewe lamb, a small little baby lamb. And here is this king who's got everything at his disposal, who can have anything that he wants, and he steals and takes away the ewe lamb from this young shepherd. And so Nathan asks King David, what do you think should happen to that king who did that horrible, horrible thing, this wealthy king stealing that lamb from that poor servant that was the only thing that he had? And David said, well, that man should surely die. And then Nathan turns to David and says, of course, you are the man. David, at that point, was cut to his heart. He was convicted. He was allowing sin to delude him and deceive him and harden his heart. And the prophet Nathan was able to convict him in a very powerful way of the heinous, heinous evil that he had committed. But David was grieved and sickened in his soul and in his heart about what he had done. So I want to read from Psalm 51, which is the psalm which deals with, let's try that again. Which is the psalm which deals with David after his this episode we just referred to. You notice here this little superscription of the psalm, a psalm of David when the prophet Nathan came to him after David had committed adultery with Bathsheba. So this psalm is unique, and it gives us the occasion for the psalm. So here's David describing and pouring out his grief and his heart to God. Have mercy on me, God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity. Cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Against you and you only have I sinned and done this evil in your sight. And he just goes on and on and on. Cleanse me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, I'll be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out my iniquity. Restore me to the joy of your salvation, and grant me a willing spirit. Look at this verse 14. Save me from blood guilt. This is being guilty of murder, having someone's blood in your hands. Save me from the guilt of murder. O God, the God who saves me, and my tongue will sing of your righteousness. And then finally, here, the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart. O God, you will not despise. David is broken, contrite. Let's think of this as a deep, deep grief, bitter grief over your sin. Grief and shame and disgrace that you feel within your soul for something evil that you have done. And what happens with David? Well, he is restored to the joy of his salvation. He is forgiven of his he is forgiven of his iniquities. Now, the consequences within time and space and history of David's decisions are not going to just magically go away. But nevertheless, David was a man who knew what mourning, experienced blessed mourning. I lost my train of thought there a little bit there. So that's one type of mourning where we can find great blessing. To be blessed in mourning is to be grieved over our sin. And then the second type of mourning to consider is the mourning, I'm going to call it mourning over the sinful state of the world and the sinful state of people in the world. This is a sure sign that we have the heart of God, that we can look at the evil and wickedness of people around us. And we live in an age where the depth of the evil and the corruption in so many different kinds of ways is beyond disheartening. It really is. It is both disheartening and it can become very angering. It certainly can be, I know for me, and that's why I want to begin here by talking about that while it is understandable that we might be very angry at the evil that people commit, the evil, horrific things that people do in this world, sometimes right under our noses, be angry at the things that are in this world that are evil. We have to always be aware that that anger can quickly turn into destructive forms of hatred and contempt for others. This is always the poison that happens when you feel an appropriate even sense of rage and anger at the wickedness of other people and the horrific things that people do to other people. Okay? Things that just outrage us and fill us with rage, and appropriately so. But we can't let that transform into these personally destructive forms of hatred and contempt for others. Now, it is certainly a sign of spiritual health that one is appropriately angered and disgusted and outraged with wicked, evil things that people do. But I want to challenge you today to understand that it is also a sign of spiritual health and moral growth and spiritual sensitivity, that you can look at that same evil and be grieved over it, and to sorrow within your soul over the corruption and the evil that lurks within the hearts of men and women, and to see its horrific effects throughout the world. And you are in a place where you know, as one single human being in a massive world that has massively gone mad and gone wrong, that you realize there is so little that you can do to affect any real difference in this large, massive world that has such massive amounts of evil, and that it is just an unbelievable moray and mess that the world is in. And here I am, one lone human being, and that sometimes the only thing that we can do is simply grieve over it. So I want to challenge you to understand that we display spiritually healthy hearts when we can see that the ultimate end of evil, apart from Christ, is misery and anguish and one's eternal loss of God. That's really, and when we can do that, when we can both at the same time have the appropriate sense of anger at the injustice in the world, but not let our anger turn into hatred and contempt, and also be grieved over the sins of others, then we find ourselves having the heart of God. Because God's heart is a heart that loves the world and who is grieved over the evil and the wickedness that is in the world. The testimony of Scripture on this is abundantly clear. I'm going to just give a few sentiments or few examples of this, with some New Testament passages. So the first two are from Jesus. So let's look at Luke chapter 19. And let's do verse 41. Okay. This is an episode where Jesus has been traveling towards the city of Jerusalem. And this is preparing for his entry into the city of Jerusalem and the events that will lead up to his arrest, his trial, and his crucifixion. But listen to what Luke says. That is, Jesus is approaching the city of Jerusalem. He saw the city and he wept over it. He wept over it. This is a visible, visceral crying. This is not just sometimes you can be sorrowful and sad and kind of keep it within yourself and try to maintain your composure. That's not what's happening here. This is a weeping over the city of Jerusalem. Why is Jesus weeping over the city? Well, he's going to explain it. And what you're going to see here is an example of what we're calling blessed mourning. Jesus says to the city, if you, even you, had known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. Now here, Jesus is speaking about the impending destruction of the city of Jerusalem and its temple, which will happen about almost 40 years, about 35 years from Jesus' time here. 35 years later, the temple and the city will be destroyed by the Romans. And he says in verse 44, this horrific description, they will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. So it's talking about the city being besieged by the Romans, and they will not leave one stone on another because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. Now, this is Jesus weeping over the city. Why? Because this city and its people were the people of all the people on the earth that were prepared for the coming of the Messiah. That God had prepared for the coming of the Messiah, and that God's purpose and plan was that they would receive and welcome the Messiah. And then, having received and welcomed Messiah, they would announce to the rest of the world the good news of the Messiah and his victory over sin in the world. But instead, as Jesus goes to this city, he's going to the city that will kill him and reject him. And because they will have rejected him, they will have irrevocably rejected any further hope of redemption. And that leaves them only now finally open to this judgment that will be found that will befall Jerusalem in about 35 more years. This is Jesus weeping over the sin of Israel, weeping over the fact that these people are going to miss and not be the benefactors of what precisely it is he came into the world to give us. The second event in Jesus is the most well-known, one of the most well-known verses in the Bible. It's the first verse everybody memorizes for their memory verse in Bible class. John 11:35, Jesus wept. Now, some people, we may say, well, this is just Jesus weeping because Lazarus was dead and the family was mourning. And certainly, we cannot dismiss that. There's no point in denying that. We see here the next verse when it says that Jesus wept. It says, see how he loved him. Okay. But I want to suggest to you that this statement here, when Jesus wept, the term here, um, it has an interesting flavor to it. The term here can mean not merely just a weeping, it can include a weeping and a sorrowing that has at the same time a kind of indignation and uh, outrage about something, while at the same time being grieved and sorrowful. You remember, Jesus is going to bring Lazarus back to life. The whole setting of what's happening in the story of Lazarus is the power of sin and death over the human family. How sin and death destroys families and destroys the joy and the happiness and relationship that God ordained us to have. And we see that coming through in Jesus' interaction with Lazarus' family and with his sisters. So when Jesus weeps, he is grieving with the family for their loss, but he's deeply grieving and wailing and profoundly indignant and outraged within himself that it is sin that has caused this. And he's grieving and sorrowful that the world has become what it is, and Lazarus is laying dead in a tomb. And this never was what God had ever purposed and planned. And so Jesus wails and he weeps and he mourns and he grieves because of all of these things, and not, I would suggest to you, not just sharing, yes, in the sorrow and the sadness of his family's grief. Okay? All right. And then I want to give two more texts here. Here's one that from the Apostle Paul in Philippians 3 and verse 8. Oh, I'm sorry. That should be verse 18. Yes, here, verse 18. For, as I have often told you before, and now say again, even with tears, many live as enemies of the cross of Christ. Now, I could easily see myself, and maybe you can too, saying, as I've told you often, and I now say again with utter disgust and outrage, that many live as enemies of the cross of Christ. I know I'm guilty of that. That's how I put it. All these horrible people in this country and horrible people in this world, I tell you what, they are enemies of the cross of Christ. I feel anger and I feel disgust and I feel outrage and I want justice to rain down on people for the wicked things that they do. And Paul says, I say this with tears, that there are many who live as enemies of the cross of Christ. Paul had some occasions to be pretty angry, didn't he? In his letters and in the book of Acts, we see Paul as a man of fierce convictions, and he could be very fierce in the face of sin and wickedness. But here he is at the same time, there's nothing contradictory about this. Here he is moved to tears as he considers the plight of those who are enemies of Jesus' cross. And then finally, from James chapter 4, there's so many more texts that deal with this theme. But James 4 verse 7, submit yourselves then to God, resist the devil and he will flee from you. Come near to God and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. Grieve, mourn, and wail. Change your laughter to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. Now here's an example where we have folks in the church, Christians, who are not experiencing mourning in the appropriate sense. They are continuing in sinful behavior, they are deluded, and they are deceived, and not realizing and aware of the depth of their wickedness and the depth of their sin. When you look earlier in this chapter, you look at their James indicts them for their worldliness, that they love the world and they do not love God, and that they are slaves to their desires and their passions. So these are men and women in the church that have allowed their lives to run amok without any sense of being under the control of the Spirit of God. And so James says, you know what? You're acting like everything's fine. Oh, I've got a good life and we're having a fun time and we're partying and enjoying everything and we're laughing it up. And Paul says, or James says, you got nothing to be laughing about, considering the fact that you are continuing in sinful behavior and oblivious to it and feel no regard and no grief over it. So he tells them to come to terms with what they've done, that they've got to grieve and mourn and wail over what they have been doing. He is trying to shake them and wake them up from their spiritual stupor and to cause them to realize where they're at. And once they come to realize where they're at, what's going to happen? If they will submit themselves to God, then what will happen? Well, resist the devil, he will flee from you. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. So be aware of your sin, be convicted of your sin, and then find the grace and the comfort that comes from God. Okay, we're going to conclude on that observation. We'll see how I'll see how things pan out next week. There are many more insights on this topic that I think might be helpful for us to be considering. So we may go ahead and do that. Let me just work on that. If not, then we'll be moving into our next beatitude, which is those blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Again, thank you for your time and your attention. God's grace and peace to you, and we'll hope to see you soon. Thank you.